Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast, which is powered by SIG. And today on the show, we're going to get tactical. We're going to discuss how we can identify supplier billing errors and recover money that's been found to be billed in error. So essentially looking into post-contract award billing compliance. And I'm joined to discuss this topic by Ben Evans. Ben works with Auditec Solutions, and while I leave Ben to share some of his background in the pod, he's an expert in contract compliance, in auditing, and in recovery. And in that conversation, we discussed tips for organizations to actually build a culture of billing compliance with their suppliers. We deep dive into audit clauses, and then Ben shares from an end-to-end perspective how a procurement professional can go through the entire audit process from an opportunity assessment to the recovery of funds or the application of credits. And so let's go straight into the conversation. And my first question, I just asked Ben if he could share a little bit more about his background.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. I went to school at the University of Utah for both accounting and information systems. And initially my career got into forensic accounting, particularly focused on contract disputes. So when large companies would have contract disputes with their suppliers or other parties, they would essentially hire an expert witness to come in and quantify what those issues were. So I worked for one of those expert witnesses in Salt Lake City. And as my career progressed, I got a CPA, and then I moved into doing contract compliance auditing for recovery audit firms and for big four accounting firms. And so, which, was adjacent to what I was doing before, but wasn't in a litigation context. It was helping our clients, which were typically large Fortune 100 to 1,000 type companies, helping them to ensure that they were getting the value that they negotiate in their contracts with their suppliers. Yeah. And so, I've been doing that. I recently moved out to Phoenix, Arizona, near my wife's family, to help start up the contract compliance auditing division at Auditec Solutions. So that is my background.
So I know we're going to talk about contract compliance, and I often like to do this because there's some terms that we think we know what they mean, and then when we dig into it, perhaps we have different interpretations of them just based on our own experience. So I wonder if you could just, so we're on the same page, define what you mean by contract compliance.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So in this context, contract compliance is focused on a supplier's compliance with the negotiated terms in a contract around billing. So contract compliance is focused on, as a procurement professional, if you're performing a contract compliance audit or looking at contract compliance in this perspective, you're concerned with whether or not you are getting the value that you've negotiated with your suppliers.
Yeah. And so it's really all on the supplier side. It's not us as a buying organization going and not complying with the contract because we're going and spending with other suppliers. Is the supplier themselves abiding by the terms of the deal for what you're buying from them? Absolutely.
Yeah, we're looking at things like rebates, warranties, pricing, simple price list errors, looking at whether or not if there's a pass-through cost that they're passing it through correctly, markups, and just all those various terms that come throughout the course of negotiations that procurement professionals are, fighting for. Yep. Certain terms to be put in there, ensuring that suppliers are actually following those terms. Because you can negotiate a great contract and get a really good deal on the table, but if it's not being followed, it kind of becomes a moot point.
So how much of a problem is this then? Is it do you see issues all over the place? Is it very targeted? I mean, I imagine it's a big enough issue for there to be an industry to support it. But I'd love kind of some perspective.
Yeah, it is a big issue from the perspective that, it's contracts are complex, right? I mean, as a procurement professional, you're negotiating an MSA initially. or some other master agreement. There's addendums, amendments. People are shifting chairs all the time. Your suppliers are often big suppliers. They have lots of different clients with totally different contracts. And so it's a challenge for suppliers to ensure that they're billing correctly. They may have terms with one of their clients that are totally different with another. And so our experience, my experience is, I'd say about between 40 and 60%. If we look at 20 suppliers, about 40 to 60% of them will have material overbillings in relation to what was negotiated in the contract. So it happens a lot, and a lot of times suppliers are doing everything correctly, but it's a challenge. I mean, the complexities and the current marketplace make it very difficult to make sure you're doing everything.
So at 40 to 60, I mean, that's a big percentage of issues. I mean, what kind of errors do you see?
Yeah, so it comes from as simple as a pricing error.
Yeah.
They were supposed to charge $3.65 for a specific item, and they charged $3.80, to much more complex things around rebates or warranties, areas of cost pass through. So with software and with facilities management and other areas, often you'll have a cost plus relationship where they're supposed to bill you at their cost plus a certain markup so that they can make a profit. We often see that the cost is being overstated, that the cost isn't the actual cost.
Yeah.
Rebates, the price changes are often built off of indexes that have pretty complex calculations. And so we see errors in those areas as well. So there's really any number of areas where you could see billing errors, but yeah, I mean, it's across the board. I mean, anything that's negotiated with one of your suppliers, they could mess up on just because they're trying to manage many different relationships with multiple clients.
Yeah. And it's something you often don't think about. You think that a supplier, well, you don't even think it could be an issue oftentimes. I know that it's something that earlier in my career, when I was buying things that perhaps would be possible candidates for issues like this, it wouldn't even cross my mind, because you just have a trust in the supplier that the price is the price, what's on the PO is what they're going to invoice. You never really do any checking. And I imagine that happens once that happens at scale. There's a lot of money involved that is overbilled and potentially underbilled as well.
Absolutely, and often what is on the PO is what is billed. They often will, but the PO is subject to a master services agreement, or it's subject to some other agreement where there's assumptions that the materials that are being used are billed through at cost plus a certain percentage. Yeah. Or that they're supposed to have a labor rate build up for hourly resources in a contingent labor relationship. And so, it's a challenge, and there's so many different parties who handle a relationship with a supplier. I mean, once a procurement professional signs a contract, you have the day-to-day resource that interacts with the supplier. You have internal audit. You've got billing resources who are essentially paying these invoices as they come in, and again, there's so many people shifting chairs that it can get lost in the weeds very quickly what the original terms were and how the supplier is supposed to be billing, and they can fall back into billing you the way maybe they billed a different company,
right,
that didn't negotiate quite as good of terms as you did.
Yeah, and it may just be that they don't have the governance process internally to recognize that they're doing that, as opposed to it being for less ethical reasons. I'm sure you see examples where maybe there's something that's going on deliberate because people think they can get away with it, but I imagine most of it is just human error. Yeah,
absolutely. We see both. I would say a majority of it is related to accidental issues. You've negotiated something, you have something in your contract that isn't standard, that's not normally done, and the billing resource isn't aware of that or executes it incorrectly. There are cases where it's deliberate, where you see a supplier taking advantage of a client, but there's also an area of contract gaps. right? So you negotiate a contract with the supplier, you look to nail down all the different areas of spend, but maybe there isn't a provision in there around how freight is supposed to be handled on IT hardware installations. And so you spend 6 months negotiating a 90-page contract, freight isn't mentioned. In those cases, a supplier can take an aggressive approach without technically having to breach the contract. Yeah. But in those situations, what you'd hope is the supplier would raise those to you and say, hey, we didn't really cover freight here. How are we supposed to handle this? And then come to an agreement. Those are also some of the issues that come out of these contract compliance reviews, is just finding out that there's an area that isn't covered by the contract that the supplier might be overly aggressive on because it's not covered by the contract, and you don't really have the same visibility into underlying costs and activities to be able to identify that issue.
So there's a couple of things I want to touch on as we kind of go through the conversation around how we can protect ourselves against one, I guess, being taken advantage of, but two, putting ourselves in the best position to claim back any monies when we find issues in billing and we find opportunities where we've perhaps been overcharged. But I want to start at the beginning by just asking a question. This is more about culture, I think. So you talked about that a supplier may take an aggressive approach and they're not in breach of a contract. And my assumption is that they'll have a good feeling for the companies where they can do that with, the clients they can do that with, and the clients that they really shouldn't be doing that with, because there's frankly a higher probability that they'll get caught for doing it. So I wonder what a procurement professional or leader can do to just create kind of a culture of compliance before we start getting into the tactics with their providers. So the providers know that, these guys are serious about making sure that everything is by the book. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it starts in the actual proposal process. So as you're considering multiple suppliers for a specific product or service, there are a few things that can be done. One is just making sure you have an audit clause in your contract. So any contract with significant spend can have a clause in it that essentially says, we have the right to audit you and to ask for underlying records that support the accuracy of your billing. We can get into later on, we can get into more depth into what would be included in one of those audit clauses. But that alone, you say if a supplier is looking at two different clients, if one has an audit clause and one doesn't, they're more likely to be more careful on the accuracy of billings for the client that does have the audit clause. Additionally, just transparency and communicating the expectation of transparency throughout the proposal and contract signing process, making sure the supplier understands that, hey, we expect if there's something here that doesn't get covered, that comes up in the course of billing us, whether it's new scope of work, we expect you to reach out and we want to have a discussion around how that's going to be handled.
Yeah.
And, I think a clear communication that, hey, this is a partnership. We want a great relationship, but a relationship that is based on both sides understanding what's going on.
Yeah.
And as transparency is communicated to the suppliers, they're more likely to be transparent, which makes it a lot more difficult to do something intentionally, but also unintentionally. If you're able to see, hey, this item didn't really cost that much, and so you shouldn't have billed me this amount, suppliers are more likely to pick that up if you have more visibility into both expectations and the actual operations once the contract gets signed.
And when you talk about transparency, are you thinking more in terms of the broader relationship with the supplier, or having something specifically talking about transparency in billing so that the other party know that specifically we're going to be keeping our eyes open, but we also expect you to come to us when you have any issues yourself, and making it very specific to billing rather than just more general in nature?
Yeah, no, that's a great quick question. So on the transparency side, there's really two areas I would focus on as a procurement professional. One would be we want to have any interpretation of the contract that is coming from a contract gap. We want to have a conversation around it, meaning both sides should have that discussion. If the contract doesn't include freight, for example, like we said before, we would expect that you would reach out and we have a conversation on how freight's supposed to be handled. On the billing side, there's lots of tools that can be used. One would be just having an SLA, SLAs and SLCs, service level agreements and service level credits that require the supplier to report certain items, asking them to provide certain data along with invoices where it's easily done is useful as well. If there's a cost plus relationship, asking them to provide third-party data. There's also tools that can be used in specific categories. So I think a lot of your listeners will probably be familiar with Ariba, which does a really good job of managing price lists. And so if you have items based on price lists, Ariba does a great job of capturing that. But in the areas of facilities or in paper, there's Facility Source, there's Service Channel, Paper Manager, specific softwares in a specific category where a procurement professional would be getting suppliers out of that capture data. They capture things like clock in and clock out data. They have modules where suppliers can upload third-party cost data, receipts, mileage reports, depending on a different category of spend. And so employing these is very helpful in a specific category of spend. It's hard to have, there's no one size fits all glove where you can say, hey, this tool does it for all these different categories, because as your listeners are aware, I mean, the difference between one category of spend and another can be extremely large.
I want to come back actually in a minute to how to figure out which categories we should focus on as being potential candidates. But we talked briefly about audit clauses, and I've always had difficulty with audit clauses, both on the buy side, where I've wanted to insert them and on the sell side when I've wanted to avoid putting them in a contract. So I've certainly seen both sides of the table on that one. I wonder if, from your perspective, there is such a thing as a one-size-fits-all audit clause, or whether it's a little bit more nuanced than that in terms of how you build an audit clause.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're a procurement professional and you're looking to bring on new suppliers, you want it to be as broad as possible. And if you're on the other side of the table, you want it to be as restrictive or non-existent as possible. And so, we would recommend to our clients to have a default audit clause that's very broad, that allows you that has, having language where you can audit the supplier or you can appoint a third party specifically to audit the party, allowing for no restrictions on timing. Although typically an audit won't extend beyond 3 years, it is nice where as a buyer, you don't have a specific restriction on timing. Having language that says all documentation that would support the accuracy of billings is generally correct. And to your point, if some of your suppliers or vendors will push back and look to restrict that language, some will just accept it. And in those cases, you have as many rights as you can get when it comes to auditing, which is always helpful. If you don't use it, you don't use it. But, on the restriction side, look and understand why they're pushing back with certain restrictions. And, ultimately, that's just one component of what might make a good execution of a contract. But looking to have broad rights is important, especially before the contract is signed. That's really the time to get that, right? Once you've been working with the supplier for 3 years and both of you are reliant on each other, it's a lot harder to have that conversation. Hey, we want to do this stuff.
And it's kind of a red flag to the supplier as well, that you suspect that there may be some opportunity there for you, because that's why you're going and asking for it. Exactly.
So, but those are generally the recommendations we have to our clients is just to make sure it doesn't restrict you. I mean, you want to be able, there's really a situation when you as a procurement professional are representing your company and you have suppliers that you've contracted with, there's really an asymmetry of information once the relationship starts. Mm-hmm. The supplier knows everything, right? They know how people clock in, they know when they clock in. If you're talking about a contingent labor agreement, if you're talking about materials, they know, they have all the information, and you really get an invoice, right? You get a purchase order and you get an invoice. And so you want to protect your rights, again, from a transparency perspective, to be able to say, hey, we want to be able to look under the hood from time to time and make sure this is operating how we expected it to. Yeah. And I don't think it's an unreasonable expectation. Suppliers will want to place restrictions around how far they have to go back, which makes sense. It's harder to pull documentation from 3 years ago, but suppliers should be comfortable with a client asking for supporting documentation and being able to review it.
Yeah, I think on the supplier side, one of the concerns is always the cost of being engaged in an audit. I know that some will say, "Oh, it's what they find," and for me, that's always certainly been less of a concern because you want to be as transparent as possible across a relationship. But they can be quite costly, or there can be a lot of work and effort that's involved. So I guess that's always been one of the pushbacks. And on the flip side, what I've seen then is suppliers putting in clauses that say, "Look, I'll do it, but I'll bill you for the time it takes my team to support the audit," because that's really what I'm most concerned about, as a way of actually getting an audit clause into a contract where otherwise they may have said, no, I'm not going to have one.
Yeah, and in that situation, I think it would be more useful to have one that the supplier can bill you for their hours than to not, because if 2 or 3 years into the relationship, you start seeing some significant red flags, at least you can make that decision about whether or not it makes sense to incur that cost. Typically our clients, if you're talking about, Fortune 1000 level clients, they'll have audit clauses that leave the burden of the audit cost on the actual client as opposed to the supplier. But that doesn't mean the supplier doesn't have to use, as you said, internal resources. And so, our clients are the ones who ultimately pay the bill for our audit services. Yeah. Or if they do it internally, they're the ones who are paying their internal auditors or post-audit teams to do that. But the suppliers do have some internal cost, to your point, right? They do have to use their resources. Some time, right? Yeah. But again, I think if you put an audit clause in early that tells them that they not only could be subject to an audit, but they should maintain records. Some suppliers can comply. We'll have engagements where we kick off engagements, and the supplier have our initial data sets back to us within 2 hours of the call. I mean, of the first call, because everything's organized well, and they've got strong systems. It's really the suppliers that maybe have a less organized or technologically advanced system that can't get the data quickly. Yeah. Those are also the ones that are have a higher likelihood of having errors slip through because things are less automated, more manual.
Now, does not having a audit clause preclude you from being able to engage with a company on an audit? Are there other ways around it?
No, absolutely not. I mean, these audits are both, so a contract compliance audit or review is both executed and settled based on a relationship, right? So it's a supplier that you have, a strong relationship with, you have ongoing spend with, ideally. And so they will have an interest in you feeling comfortable with what's occurring, with some reasonable restrictions, right? And so, no, I'd say a good portion of the engagements we kick off don't have audit clauses, and the suppliers work with us. And whether there's an audit clause or not an audit clause, we look to, we and I think a client or a procurement professional is looking to test these areas themselves, should look to be thoughtful around what's requested and what's needed, because you don't necessarily need to have everything provided for the last 3 years to perform a review. You can spot check, 10 or, as a procurement professional, you can spot check 10 or 20 invoices, get all the support for those invoices over a time period. And if everything checks out, have pretty strong comfort that things are operating well, right? So it's important that when these are executed, that the supplier and their time invested or are taken into account as well. And I think as long as you do that, going back to your original question, suppliers aren't typically going to push back too much unless they have a specific concern.
Right. So I want to think about, kind of how we can engage with a program that helps us identify compliance-related cost savings opportunities, because it's something that I see it's often programmatic. So yes, there may be individual suppliers that we decide every now and then we want to go and do a compliance check because we have some suspicion. But a lot of time, certainly in companies that I've worked with and for, they've had some kind of cost pressure, and they're looking at other ways to take cost out, and have identified compliance as a tactic to do so. And so as we think about this on a more programmatic basis, like, how do you recommend people determine which suppliers to look at or which categories? Are there any categories that are more likely to have opportunities to save money through a compliance audit than others?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are definitely any category that has cost as a basis. When I say cost, I mean the supplier's cost as a major component of how things are supposed to be billed in one of the categories. That's a good area. So what do I mean by that? Like facilities suppliers, for example, or construction suppliers. Often the materials that they use, which are a significant portion of billings, are supposed to be billed in a cost plus manner.
Yeah.
In software and in hardware, you'll see situations where one of your suppliers or vendors is supposed to bill you the actual cost plus a certain amount. So those are always good things to take a look at. Rebates and warranties are really important as well. Rebates from the perspective of there's going to be some calculation. In that case, you're asking your supplier to either pay a check back to you or to deduct something from a future billing. Mm-hmm. And so there's a strong incentive to be kind of liberal in the interpretation of how that's supposed to be executed. And then when it comes to warranties, that's a complex area when you're dealing with services and a supplier failed to perform the service and had to come back out. Do they have the necessary tracking in their system to be able to say, hey, this is something that should fall under the warranty provision of the contract? So I guess those are things we're looking for in areas, but at a high level, some of the areas we target are temporary labor, mm-hmm. temporary staffing, contingent labor, that whole space. Facilities, as I've said before, where that is applicable. So people who come in and perform HVAC services, electrical. Construction is another area where there's a decent amount of overbilling. Technology, which is growing in the software, hardware, and labor areas. So there's if the more complexity there is in the relationship, the better targeted it typically is, I guess would be the easiest way to say it. Yeah, right. So if you're looking at a contract that has a lot of different components and multiple fees, and there's been price changes, and there's rebates that are tied to it, and there's some things that are based on cost that should be passed through, and there's warranty expectations. There's just a lot there, mm-hmm. and that creates an opportunity to be able to, as a procurement professional, internally, if you don't want to go to the effort of kicking off a full scope audit, to kick the tires, to look to pull a few invoices, figure out, look at the contract and determine what the expectations were, and to ask for some basic documentation to gain some level of comfort that things are operating correctly.
Now, would you recommend that you start there by just doing a little bit of a random spot check versus going and doing a full-blown audit, and that the spot check then informs you on which specific suppliers you may want to go and dig deeper on?
Yeah, so if a procurement professional is looking to do this internally, one thing is just, how much time do you guys have, right? I mean, you have so many things that are on your plate, and so you're not going to be able to go perform a full scope audit yourself. You can engage internal audit or other, finance or other departments within the company, but they're generally busy as well. So one thing that you can do is just look to spot check from time to time. Look to go to a supplier and audit a specific invoice. If you haven't looked at it for a while, when the invoice comes through, look at what the expectations are and ask them to support, support the cost pass-through area, show what their actual invoice was, or, look to ensure that that invoice wasn't reworked for work that was already performed. That's kind of the initial spot check, I think, for any procurement professional who's tight on time. You can also look to request from the supplier a line item billing detail. So everyone who's billing you has a billing system that is storing all of the data at a line item level. That's how those invoices are being created. And you can request that for typically a 2 or 3 year period, and you can do some pretty quick and dirty price testing, and you can also look to see if there's been any changes in a specific product. That's something that I think most procurement professionals could pick up and do it themselves. They could also employ the help of internal audit or post audit functions at their company to do some of those reviews. If issues are found, if you start to see things that are concerning, that's where you may look to move towards a full scope audit of the supplier.
Now, how can we kind of force the supplier to comply with a request, or have them comply with it in a timely manner? Because a lot of times when I've tried to do that back when I was buying more direct components, and it really depends on the relationship we have with a supplier. For sure, some will respond quickly. Some will say, yes, sure, I'll do it. And then it takes them 3 months. And others will say, absolutely not, I don't share this information. It's all proprietary to me.
That sounds familiar. Absolutely. And that will come up, and it's a potential red flag when a supplier won't share something. So if you as a procurement professional have, a dozen suppliers that you want to make sure they are operating correctly or do some type of investigation into, when you request this information, my experience is probably, 60 to 75% of them will turn around the information quickly and have it available to you. And often those ones have a higher likelihood of having no issues. Yeah. Again, kind of going back to earlier in our conversation, about half, if not more than half of your suppliers will be really clean. Like even if you have a professional firm come in and audit them, they'll come out, looking great. So, if you're looking to go up to a dozen and you have those 3 or 4 that won't provide the data timely, they're kind of having the conversation around why you're asking it, asking for it. Setting a follow-up call to discuss the document collection process is always helpful. So if they're going to take 3 months to get you the data back, look to ask the data and schedule a touch point in 2 weeks just to ask how the collection's going. So, suppliers too have a lot of different things pulling at them. But, if they know it's something that's not just going to get forgotten
keep them accountable
on your side, and they'll provide it. A lot of times it's just you're being deprioritized. It's not anything malicious or they don't want to provide the data. It's just, you're being deprioritized. And so by kind of putting a check in on the calendar, hey, let's have a check in on the document collection. That increases the likelihood you'll get it within a timely manner, but also allowing them to have some time to collect the data as well. I mean, don't ask for it tomorrow. Exactly. I mean, as an audit firm, we don't do that, and I think our clients shouldn't do it as well. But if a supplier has a strong relationship with you, meaning there's significant ongoing spend, and they are pretty sure you want to look into this, at some point they'll let you look into it. But they, if there are concerns on their side, whether they know they've overbilled or they just know that it's a weak enough control environment where there's a good chance they overbilled, then they're really going to kind of test your resolve to see how much you really want to do it,
Yeah, see if it goes away or not.
Exactly.
What's a reasonable time frame to give a supplier to respond to a data request?
We typically start with 1 to 2 weeks on if we're asking for a line item billing report. That's something that can be pulled within 15 minutes, but they may need to break it up to email it or provide it via FTP. They have other things on their queue.
Yep.
And so we'll typically start with 1 to 2 weeks, but we'll also communicate, hey, if there's any concerns with this timeline on your side, let us know. And we just want to make sure we have aligned expectations. And so some suppliers will come back and say, hey, we have a pretty disparate system for whatever reason, and it's hard to gather this information, this may take us a couple of extra weeks. And, as long as both sides have a date set and they're aware that there's a date set and they agree on it, I think that's fine. So, and also take into consideration seasonality, right? If you're asking for data from an HVAC company in the middle of July in Florida, right? That's going to be maybe not the right time.
Yeah, they may have other things going on.
Exactly. Yeah. So, as long as as an audit firm, and again, we're not the same as a procurement professional asking, but we are working on behalf of a shared client. As an audit firm, we look to be partnering with the supplier as much as possible to just make this a collaborative process. As we see issues or potential questions, we raise them. They understand the billings better than anyone, and so as a procurement professional, I think if you kind of ask questions and just say, hey, we just want to make sure this is working correctly, we want to work closely to make sure this is happening. Most companies will appreciate that and work with you.
Yeah. You kind of give them the trust that they're doing everything they can to give you the information you've asked for in a responsible time frame, and only if you then start to see signs of are they really holding up to their end of the bargain, that's when you be a little bit more aggressive on in terms of are they trying to avoid this and just stall versus is there a genuine reason why it may be taking them a little bit longer.
Exactly.
So we have the data, we've done an analysis, we've found opportunities where there's been some overbilling. What does the recovery process look like?
Yeah, and this is a challenging process. I mean, the first thing you want to do is get a good quantification. And so, simple issues like pricing errors, you can turn over to either your internal audit department, your post audit department, someone in finance if it's a smaller organization, and have them quantify the issues down to the penny. Mm-hmm. On larger issues, more complex issues like cost pass-through, you want to make sure you have as much information as possible. So if you sampled a few invoices and found out that they're charging you $200 for something that cost $100 and it was supposed to be cost plus 20%, that's where you probably need to move into a full contract compliance audit.
Yeah.
And you would need to either gather data that would allow you to quantify the issue over the entire time period, whether that's 2 or 3 years, or you'd have to do some type of a statistically valid sample process. And again, for companies wanting to do this internally, where it doesn't make sense to engage an outside firm, internal audit, this is kind of their bread and butter. This is things that they're doing on a regular basis. So engaging them for that process is probably a good idea. We can talk about it later on, but engaging an outside firm to assist in this would be helpful as well, depending on the materiality of the issue. But ultimately, once you've quantified it and you have a strong basis for quantification, you look to report those findings directly to the supplier. I think a clear communication that we understand this stuff, depending on the nature of the issue, but 95% of issues, it's not fraud, it's not something that you're going to ruin the relationship over. If you can communicate early on that, something went wrong, but we still value this relationship, you're still a strategic partner, we're going to get through this, but we're going to get it corrected.
Yeah.
Is really the best communication we can see coming from procurement professionals. Just because once the supplier realizes there's an ongoing relationship and they haven't done something that's going to, they don't want to pay back some money only to lose the relationship the next day and have it severed.
Yeah.
And so if they feel like in good faith that the relationship is going to move forward, they're much more likely to work with. Often these amounts get settled, especially where, maybe you had an expectation based on some language that you thought was very clear and they've taken a different interpretation. You may feel very strongly about it, but they possibly may feel strongly as well. And so in those cases, again, you communicate, we're not okay with what happened here. This is a good relationship. We want to fix it moving forward and align our expectations. We do expect some of this to be paid back. And so, if you want to come back to us with a settlement offer, that would be we can kind of start discussions there. It goes back to resolve again. If it's clear that the relationship is going to move forward, but that this will need to be resolved, most suppliers will work towards a resolution.
Yeah, and an important point, because it was something I was going to follow up on in terms of settlement, is that it's not necessarily that you get 100% recovery, but you are able to settle and recover some amount of money. Also, that it doesn't have to be a one-time cash payment. It's not like you have to demand to your supplier, hey, give me the cash now. Now, sometimes you might want to do that, but depending on the nature of the relationship too, it could be that it's structured in a different way where it's credits off future bills.
Exactly.
As opposed to it just being, write me a check for $100,000 tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's, we with our clients, we try to give recommendations on settlement, strategy, and one of them is exactly what you just said. If it's possible, if you feel comfortable with it, take it as an offset for future billings over a certain time period, because that again communicates to the supplier there are going to be future billings.
Right.
This relationship is ongoing. We're okay with things not being perfect, but what we're not okay with is just ignoring the imperfections, right? So we want to raise topics, we want to raise problems, we want to work through them, and we want our relationship to be better in 2, 3, 4 years than it is today. And so, yeah, absolutely. If you can take that back over a certain time period, if you can, you don't always want to meet in the middle, but if you can, show some give on your side and expect the same on their side, rational parties can kind of come to a situation, and then we can get into this as the discussion progresses, but a lot of this is about then fixing it moving forward. So now we do understand, now we do have a transparent, clear expectation between the two parties of how this is supposed to happen the next time you create a bill, right?
Yeah, and so would you look at then advising a client to put in place some kind of governance process going forward, so that there's a lot closer oversight, perhaps for a period of time, or would you look at that for really the duration of the contract? That this supplier has been proven to be one that's not necessarily in control of everything that it bills.
I mean, we do make recommendations on things that can be fixed on both the client and the supplier side. We would make recommendations on ways the client can check that. Depending on the complexity, it may require you take a look at it a year or two later to make sure. So it's not uncommon where we have a settlement at the end of an audit and the client asks us to come back in a year to basically look at the previous year to see if there's any remaining issues in that area. The problem with governance, right, is it does take some time to look at certain things and to do that. And so, we're aware of that environment. And so, a lot of times it's just the clear communication of expectations. And so if they were, if the expectation said that it was cost plus 20% and they're billing you a $200 list price that they bill everyone that comes in the door, once that's clarified and both sides understand it, it's a lot less likely to occur. And so, yes, you can go back and spot check it later. A client will sometimes ask a supplier of ours will ask a supplier to provide certain data from that point moving forward, either on a full, on every single invoice or on some, random occurrence of those invoices, ask for, supporting third-party documentation. But the idea is you never get to perfection, right? You move closer to an agreement, to an operating environment that's in line with the agreement, right? And in 2 or 3 years, you might find out there's something else. But if you had $2 million of overcharges and you resolved it and settled it for 1.5, if you audit that company again, from my experience, if you audit them again in 2 or 3 years, you're not going to find that large of an issue. Right. You might find $200,000 or $300,000 now, but the expectations have been clarified, and the, as you said, the culture of compliance has been communicated to the supplier in a manner where they're probably not going to make that large of a mistake again. Yeah, it's possible, but it's not.
And if they do, there's bigger problems, I guess, within that organization.
Exactly. So, yeah.
So I have a couple of last questions just to touch on. When we talked before we hit record, You wanted to make sure that the conversation was focused on what professionals can do in their day-to-day jobs around recovering amounts, versus going and using a provider. But, I think it's important to ask this question. When does it make sense for a procurement group to actually look to engage with an outside partner to help them with an audit recovery process rather than doing it on their own?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. There's multiple triggers there. I think the first one would be just the time constraint, right? I mean, do you have time to be doing these things? And if you feel like this is an area of concern or something that you want to get your arms around, but you have too many other initiatives going on, that might be a good sign that some other firm could come in and help you. Yeah. If, like you said, if you go through a review and you're finding really big potential issues that could be millions of dollars for your organization or even hundreds of thousands of dollars for your organization, but they're significant, and you don't feel like your organization has the time or skill set to be able to perform the work, that's a good time to bring in a provider. For larger organizations, we recommend this as just a best practice, right? So we would our recommendation is if you're a Fortune 1000, probably even the Fortune 2000 level company, you probably should have a program ongoing. Just looking at different suppliers on 5 to 10 on an ongoing basis, just so that it's happening. So, but it does really kind of come down to the cost benefit of having an internal resource as opposed to an outside resource performing it.
What are the kind of typical commercial models for these services? Is it fixed fee? Is it gain share? Is it a little bit of both?
Yeah, so typically these are contingent. So if you have a recovery audit firm that comes in and performs the work, or even some of the big four firms that perform contract compliance auditing, let's say the big four accounting firms, some of them have divisions that do this a bit. They'll typically do it as a percentage of what's recovered. Yeah. So the idea behind that is there's no budget that needs to be allocated to it. You can, and it's actual amounts recovered. It's not amounts identified. So if a client of ours, if we identify $3 million of overcharges and they settle it for $1.8 million, then it's a percentage of the $1.8 million of the money that's actually recovered once it's recovered. And so there are also, any firm is also happy to do it on an hourly basis, and some firms have a larger percentage of hourly basis clients or agreements, but that obviously it gets more challenging for a procurement department or for internal audit or whoever's championing the program to be able to allocate the budget, as opposed to saying, hey, this is a revenue center, right? If we're going to look at 20 suppliers and we recover, $800,000 at the end of the year, we pay a contingency on that $800,000, and the rest is just revenue. There's no cost to the organization.
Yeah. So I have, I don't know if it's a personal bias or a concern, and I've talked about this on the show a little bit before about gain share and contingency work, where it's really important to make sure that objectives are aligned, because you can really quickly have differing objectives when when essentially you're looking to recover as much as you possibly can because it supports your fees, because the contingent basis where a buyer may look at that and say, look, my relationship with this my relationship with this supplier is important, that I don't want to go after the full amount of recovery. And I just wonder how firms in this space actually manage that, what could be a potential conflict, so that it doesn't actually impact upon the relationship.
Yeah, and it comes up. But, it's typically something we expect. We understand it's kind of a part of performing these services. And so, a couple of years ago, I kicked off a large 20 supplier engagement with a Fortune, 50 client. And we had some significant recoveries in it. We also had about 2 or 3 very large issues we'd identified, but based on the relationship, based on a multitude of factors, that the client decided not to pursue them. Yeah. And that's kind of part of the process. And so we understand that our incentives are to recover as much money as possible, but we'll also be out of business pretty quickly if clients feel like we damage supplier relationships.
Yeah.
And so, we've got kind of both of those. I mean, we could have, a quick win and have a client not want to do the work in the future. But, typically if we're looking at an engagement of, 10 or 20 suppliers, we will expect that, a couple of them, there might be some significant issues that just aren't recoverable. And that's kind of built into the pricing, right? I mean, so that indirectly affects, what percentage we're willing to do the work for.
Yeah.
But ultimately,
but you'll be assuming
the client's got to be able to determine.
Yeah, you'll be assuming that you're not going to recover everything that's identified for a bunch of reasons, and you've got your experience that suggests what that number typically is. So you've already factored that in really into your commercial model.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the client has to determine how these issues are not only communicated to the client, but how they're to the suppliers, but ultimately settled. And so, we look to report to the client. We make recommendations. We don't present any quantifications or anything that would be, controversial or challenging to the supplier before the client's reviewed it in depth and given the green light to move forward with it. And so, even in the supplier selection, when we're looking with a client to decide what suppliers should be kicked off, a lot of suppliers are taken off the list for that exact reason before the work's even performed. Yeah. Hey, if we found issues here, we wouldn't go after it. Right. Because they're so strategic, or they're bigger than us. They can bully us, and that does happen. It does make sense in some cases. And so, again, we look to have just a high level of communication with the client throughout the process, so that we keep that number down as much as possible. But we do realize it's going to occur. And ultimately, want to do what's best for the client, which in many cases, is to go after and to recover money, but in a lot of cases it isn't.
Yeah, it can be used as another point of leverage, perhaps, on something else that's going on in the relationship. It can be used for a magnitude of reasons other than just trying to get additional cash.
Absolutely. And fix problems moving forward.
Yeah.
Sometimes if you're not able to get a large recovery, if let's say you get, $10,000 off of a $100,000 finding, you still might be able to close that gap and save $50,000 a year moving forward.
Well, Ben, I want to really thank you for taking the time to kind of walk us through the process of how to think about, identifying opportunities for contract compliance recoveries, and then the recovery process itself. I think it's really insightful, and it's something that we sometimes shy away from because we think it's too complex. But as you mentioned earlier, there's some small things that we can do to really help us with an opportunity assessment, if you will, to see that there may be opportunities here for cost savings, or and that doesn't necessarily need to take a lot of work. So thank you. I'm just going to ask my final question, and that's if listeners would like to engage with you and get to know you and just chat about perhaps opportunities that they may see, where should they find you?
Yeah, my email is ben.evans@auditecsolutions.com, and I think we'll put those in the show notes. The website for the company I work for is auditecsolutions.com. We also have a LinkedIn, Twitter account, so I think most social media sites, feel free to reach out to me, via email directly or through one of those mediums.
Perfect. All right. Well, we will put those in the show notes. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/Ben Evans. That's all one word. That's artofprocurement.com/Ben Evans. Ben, one last time, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.